So again, hello, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining our October 2024 edition of the NRCS Conservation Outcomes webinar series. My name is Elizabeth Creech-Thomas, and I'm the Acting Outcomes Team Leader with USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, or NRCS. And we host these webinar series as one of our team's deliverables to provide findings, data, and tools to support you all. So in attendance, we'll have agricultural producers, conservation partners, NRCS staff, and researchers, all sharing often a common goal of pursuing voluntary conservation across the nation. There's one thing I want to share up front, and we'll share this at the end. So what if you want to know about upcoming webinars or how to learn more and get the recording from today's webinar after the event? So to stay in the loop with us, the best way to do it is to subscribe to our Conservation Outcomes Gov Delivery list. That's an email list for email updates on this webinar series. And you can access a direct link to that via the meeting chat. And also, and you'll hear me say this URL several times today, but you can subscribe at any time by visiting our webpage for this webinar series on the public NRCS website. That webpage is nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. So please subscribe and you will get direct information to your inbox. Finally, a few webinar FAQs. So these are common questions we get. The first, can I access live captioning? The answer is absolutely yes. So if you go to the top right corner, you will see the More button is shown on the screen. And then if you go to Language and Speech, you'll have that captioning option in that section. Can I ask questions? The answer is please do ask questions. So we will have our presentation. You have access to the chat as attendees. Please write questions at any point. You don't have to hold them till the end. Add them to the chat as you think of them. And then we will facilitate a Q&A at the end with our presenter where you'll get your questions answered. We may have more than we have time to answer. And if so, you can follow up with us, email address on the screen and in the chat, and we'll get back to you. And then the final question, how do I access the slides from today, additional resources, and the webinar recording? So the slides from today's presentation and the recording will be available online by early November. And again, our Conservation Outcomes webinar series webpage is the place to access those. And with that, I am very pleased to pass the mic to Dr. Taryn Hilsman. He's our NRCS Deputy Chief for Soil Science and Resource Assessment. Dr. Hilsman, thank you so much for your time today, sir.
Well, thank you, Creech, and thanks for all the work on this. And really excited about this opportunity to be on this webinar with all of you guys today. Again, my name is Taryn Hilsman, and as Creech alluded to, I am now the Deputy Chief for Soil Science and Resource Assessment for the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. And I've only been in this position since July, but I can tell you it's just been a pleasure and an honor to serve in this position. And I continue to learn so much more about our deputy area and all the work going on around soils every day. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on if you're on the West Coast or not, or where you are across the landscape. Just want to welcome everyone to the October edition of our Conservation Outcomes webinar series. Again, it's a pleasure to have all of you, and we're looking forward to a really great discussion today. As you know, at USDA and NRCS, one of our driving missions is to work with farmers, ranchers, and forest land managers across the country to strengthen working lands and conserve natural resources. One of the primary things that we do to accomplish that mission is generate and share the data, the technology, and standards that enable landowners and many of our conservation partners. And I know there's many of our conservation partners on today, and this is not a mission that we can carry out without you. So certainly thanks for the partnership and thanks for being on today. But all of this data, technology, and standards help us to make sure that the decisions, conservation practice decisions, and things that we help producers with out there on the land are informed by objective and reliable science. Many of you have heard of CEAP, our Conservation Effects Assessment Program, and that project plays a key role in this. CEAP is a multi-agency effort to quantify the effects or outcomes of voluntary conservation across working lands nationwide. And through CEAP, NRCS collaborates with science partners and other federal agencies and members of academia, like our presenter today, to assess the outcomes of voluntary conservation efforts over time and support science-backed, data-driven decision-making. Today's webinar actually focuses on CEAP watershed studies, which provide in-depth evaluation of water quality, water availability, and soil concerns at the watershed scale and within watersheds. So you might be asking the question, what have we really learned about managing for water quality outcomes and watershed health through these studies over the past 20 years? Well, that's exactly what our presenter is here today to talk with us about and see what we can all learn more about what we've learned about all the work that we've done and what outcomes are coming from the conservation practices that we've put across the landscape. Before I became the Deputy Chief for Soil Science and Resource Assessment just in this past year, another position that I held was the Maryland State Conservationist position from about 2015 to 2022. So about 7 years there working in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I can tell you that the CEAP studies were an important tool. They continue to be an important tool for communicating with all those stakeholders and partners in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, but in watersheds all across our country, to talk about the effectiveness of our conservation practices, but also to talk about ways that we can enhance what we're doing out there in working with our conservation stewards across the land. So very, very important. And now in my new role, or in my current role, I'm certainly proud of the role this science plays in helping us understand how to best assess and plan effective conservation options with producers to address water quality concerns. So again, it's really good to have you guys here today. I want to take this time now, though, to introduce our speaker for this afternoon or this morning. It's my pleasure to introduce North Carolina State University's Dr. Deanna Osmond. Dr. Osmond led a collaborative effort with NRCS, USDA's NIFA, National Institute of Food and Agriculture, and a large team of university researchers, extension professionals, and USDA Agricultural Research Service scientists to synthesize the lessons learned on watershed conservation practice effects for water quality and soil resources. Dr. Osmond is recently retired, so we certainly want to appreciate her and thank her for coming on and being with us here today. And so with no further delay, Dr. Osmond, I'm going to turn it over to you. And again, thanks so much for your work and thanks so much for being on today.
Thank you, Dr. Hillsman, for that lovely introduction. I really appreciate it. I just want to make sure from the staff that you can see my slides in presentation mode. Are we good?
Not yet on my end. Let's try one more time.
You're not seeing them yet?
I am not. Lisa or Laura, are you all seeing them?
Okay, let me try again. So this is the hardest, right?
Yes, this is absolutely the hardest part of the presentation. It's all downhill from here.
Okay, let's try this.
Would you like, oh, I think you're going to get it now.
Are you seeing
There
it?
it is.
Yep.
Yes.
All right. Well, thank
There
you
we
all
go.
for your patience as I pulled them up, and I take it they're in presentation mode?
They are perfect.
Great. Okay, so I'm really excited to be here today to talk about conservation planning and implementation for healthy watersheds. And I appreciate NRCS inviting me to talk to the Conservation Outcomes webinar series. So let's start about 50 years ago when the federal government started looking at the relationship of agricultural conservation practices and water quality change. They have done many studies across the years. And specifically, I'm going to talk to the National Institute of Food and Agriculture, or NIFA, Conservation Effects Assessment Project from 2004 to 2011. But I'm also going to mention the Rural Clean Water Program. It was a 15-year, $50 million, 23 watershed project where many, many lessons were learned. And a few of those lessons trickled down into US EPA, and specifically the Section 319 National Non-Point Source Monitoring Program. And I will just touch on that program too. But as Dr. Hilsman has already spoken to, currently that effort is contained within CEAP program. So there was a project that I led where we synthesized and extended the lessons learned from the NIFA-CEAP watershed studies. There were 13 of them. We had two really straightforward objectives. One was to describe and summarize the lessons learned from the CEAP projects, and we needed to make sure it was science-based. The second was to take these lessons learned and deliver the knowledge to policymakers within key organizations such as NRCS and EPA. So it was very straightforward. Now, in order to be one of the 13 watersheds that were ultimately selected to be part of the NIFA-CEAP competitive grant watershed study, all of the projects had to be functioning at a watershed scale. That's really important. And they also had to have prior conservation, agricultural conservation implemented at the watershed. In addition, they were required to have 5 to 10 years of water quality and, importantly, land treatment data. And all of the watersheds that were ultimately selected were either cropland or pasture. Now, every single NIFA project that was selected was expected to answer the 4 following questions. The first was, how do the timing, location, and implemented practices affect water quality at the watershed scale? So keep in mind, again, this is at the watershed scale. What are the relationships among conservation practices implemented with respect to their impact on water quality? In other words, are there trade-offs? What social and economic factors facilitate or impede implementation of conservation practices? Almost all the projects did a reasonably good job of trying to address these 3 questions. The question that was really hard for any of them to answer is this 4th one. What is the optimum set of conservation practices and optimal placement within the watershed to achieve water quality goals? So when you look at the watersheds that were selected that met the competitive requirements, they were as far west as Oregon and as far east as New York. They were as far north as Idaho and as far south as Georgia. And if you look at where the projects are distributed, there were a fair number of different agroecological zones in which these projects resided. Now, more specifically, here are the 13 watersheds, first by state, then the water resource that they were trying to protect or clean up. You'll notice there are anything from creeks to rivers to reservoirs to large lakes. The pollutants of concern ranged from temperature, E. coli, and atrazine. These were minor pollutants of concern. The major pollutants of concern in almost all the watersheds were either nitrogen, phosphorus, and or sediment. And then the pollutant sources tended to be fairly diverse. They could be cropland, they could come from animals, they could come from developed lands. Now, the one watershed that I want to point out was in Nebraska. It was a groundwater watershed, if you can call it that, and they were looking at irrigated croplands. So with that basic background, let me just talk about who was able to show water quality results. So 6 of the projects were able to demonstrate water quality changes at the watershed scale. All of these projects had something in common. They had significant conservation practice implementation and appropriate water quality monitoring. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the water quality monitoring. 3 of them employed long-term monitoring, and by long-term, I mean 20 years or more. 3 of them used a paired watershed design. Now, let me just say that paired watershed designs were actually developed from the Rural Clean Water Program. That's where this design came into being. And 2 of these 3 paired watersheds were part of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency 319 National Non-Point Source Monitoring Program. Now, there are 2 other things that I want to say here, is that there were projects that had significant conservation practice implementation and appropriate water quality monitoring that were not able to show water quality change. And none of the 6 projects that demonstrated water quality change actually met their TMDLs. So we asked the question, well, what affected the success of the conservation? And there were some conservation implementation and policy issues that prevented projects from demonstrating water quality effects. Sometimes the conservation practices did not address the pollutant or pollutants of concern. Sometimes these practices did not match the pollutant source or sources. Sometimes the practices were not implemented in the critical source areas. Now, just to make sure everybody's on the same page, critical source areas are those portions of the watershed that provide a disproportionate amount of the pollutant. Sometimes the practices were not used by the landowners or they were not maintained. So I want to talk about lessons learned from NIFA-CEAP. We had many lessons learned, but I only have time to focus on what I consider the top 13. The first lesson was that with dwindling resources and mounting environmental degradation, it's essential that many of the lessons from NIFA-CEAP be integrated into policy and agency protocol if water resources are to be protected or improved. Now, I mentioned the Rural Clean Water Program. I actually was part of this initiative at the very end. We put together many, many lessons learned. Here are a selected group of lessons learned that I think are probably the most important. And I just want to go through them very quickly because what we found is the NIFA-CEAP lessons learned were almost identical to the Rural Clean Water Program lessons learned. So first, you need to identify the water quality problem and the source of the problem, and then make sure you have developed goals and objectives before the project starts to tackle the problem. Community consensus is critical to get the project going and off the ground and working well. Institutional involvement was important, whether at the federal, state, and/or local levels. And then if you have all those things, you should then start selecting your appropriate conservation practices relative to the water quality problem and the sources. And then you should put together a system of practices to handle these pollutants of concern. And so that's avoid, control, and trap, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And then it's really important to use both the appropriate water quality monitoring design and then also have land treatment data that you can link to the water quality monitoring. So again, we wanted to make sure NIFA-CEAP got the lessons learned into the hands of the folks that could use them. Now we asked the question, what would make conservation practice implementation better? These are 3 of the watersheds that we studied. And let me just say that the second lesson learned was that conservation planning must be done at the watershed scale with sufficient water quality and potentially modeling information before you put conservation practices on the ground. This particular project in Kansas, the watershed fed into a very important drinking water reservoir for the city of Wichita. And the folks that were working on this project found after the fact that they should have done a little bit more planning to make sure they understood what the problem was and where it was coming from before they put the conservation practices on the ground. The third most important lesson that we learned is before implementing these conservation practices, there are some things that are really important to do. So first of all, you need to identify the pollutant or pollutants of concern, what's causing your water quality problem. And what are your pollutant pathways and where are the sources of these pollutants coming from? So once you have answers to that, then you match your conservation practices to these sources and their hydrologic pathways. And as I already mentioned, it's really important to use systems of conservation practices and be aware of conservation practice trade-offs. So specifically, I want to talk to C and D for just a minute. So when I started working at the interface of nutrient management, conservation practices, and water quality in the early 90s, we were already talking about the importance of pollutant control as a system of agricultural practices. It's very much like any engineering principle in that you need to have redundancy. So first of all, you minimize the availability of the pollutant or pollutants, and then you retard the transport and or delivery of them. And finally, you remediate or intercept them before or after it's delivered to the water resource. So this was very much along the lines of EPA's reduce, reuse, recycle. More recently, NRCS has said just act, and that is avoid the problem, control the problem, and track the problem. So again, it's the importance of systems for reducing pollutants of concern. So one of the things that the NIFA-CEAP really wanted to do is find out if there were these pollutant trade-offs in conservation practices. And we did find some pollutant trade-offs, and I want to go through 4 watersheds where we found these. One of the watersheds that we were looking at fed into a very large lake that was a drinking water resource for a number of different communities, including one very large city. And they had been having problems with algal blooms. And so they decided to switch to conservation tillage. And they started seeing some improvement in their water quality. But when the farmers switched to conservation tillage, they also switched their fertilization. So rather than putting it on in the spring and knifing it in, they started applying it on the surface in the fall. And there also seemed to be an increase in tile drainage in the watershed. And all of this led to increased dissolved phosphorus losses and increased algal blooms in the watershed. Another trade-off occurred in a different watershed where they had terraces, grassed waterways, and drains. They saw a reduction in sediment and phosphorus, but they saw an increase in nitrogen leaching. A third watershed that had trade-offs, they used conservation tillage on clay pan soils, and they saw an increase in atrazine runoff. And last but not least, another watershed that had very successful series of terraces to reduce sediment erosion, they found that as farmers switched to conservation tillage and bought larger machinery, the larger machinery caused terrace deconstruction and ephemeral erosion started in the farmer's field. So I want to talk about tillage effects relative to nitrogen and phosphorus. And this is a meta-analysis. So for those of you not familiar with meta-analysis, researchers take data from different research articles and put them together. And I want to talk about how these figures work. One on your left is changes in phosphorus concentration. One on your right is changes in phosphorus load. That's the one I want to talk about because it's easier for me to think in loads and concentrations. If the median value and the bars are to the left of the dotted line, it means that conservation tillage is, that particular nutrient is reduced through the use of conservation tillage. Likewise, if the median and the error bars are to the right of the dotted line, then what it means is that nutrient is actually increased by conservation tillage. And so what this meta-analysis shows is the particulate P, that is the phosphorus attached to the sediment, is well reduced with conservation tillage because conservation tillage is so effective at reducing sediment. However, it increases dissolved P. Now, particulate P reductions are greater than total P because total P is a combination of particulate P and dissolved P. And I just want to mention the 3 reasons why dissolved phosphorus often increases under conservation tillage. First of all, you're putting the fertilizer on the surface. It's very soluble, it can run off. Secondly, because you're putting the phosphorus on the surface, it's building soil test phosphorus, which increases the phosphorus available in the surface soil to run off. And last but not least, you should be having more residue, and residue can contribute to dissolved phosphorus. There are also meta-analysis. This is just one I pulled, showing the relationship between tillage and nitrogen losses. This one shows anywhere between a 4 to 14% increase in nitrate leaching losses. And what they concluded based on the data is it's primarily associated with increased drainage, which is exactly what you're looking for with conservation tillage. You're trying to increase your macropores, increase your water infiltrating, and that can lead to additional drainage. And so these are trade-offs that we have to think about when we're looking at conservation practices. The 4th lesson learned that I want to mention is identifying critical source areas to target conservation practices within watersheds. Now, this watershed was in Missouri. It was the NIFA-CEAP watershed, and they looked at critical source area for sediment. And they found the areas where they believe sediment is of greatest loss. They also did a similar exercise for atrazine. What they found is their critical source areas for their atrazine were very different than their critical source areas for sediment. 2 other watersheds looked at critical source areas, and they used very different tools apart from each other and also apart from Missouri. I think perhaps we have some better tools now to look at critical source area than we did a number of years ago, but it still is not a trivial exercise. Last thing I also want to say is that there are some watersheds that don't have critical source areas. If you think of a watershed that's completely tile drained, it's not going to have a critical source area. And so I'd like to talk now about how important it is to identify watershed farmers' attitudes towards ag and conservation practices. We did a key informant interview as part of the synthesizing lessons learned. And what that meant is that we talked to anywhere between 10 and 25 people within each watershed. These oftentimes are farmers, sometimes agency people. They were randomly selected. And this is what we learned in talking to those folks. First of all, the ability to see the pollutant really helps farmers think about conservation practices. You can see sediment, you can't see nutrients. A number of these watersheds were under the threat of regulation, and so the farmers were very interested in conservation practices. There were changes in technology that were happening that oftentimes helped the farmers adopt conservation practices, and think of no-till and the herbicides available to the farmers that had a conservation belief system tended to adopt conservation practices at a higher rate. Older farmers tended to be more resistant to conservation practice adoption simply because of the economics associated with the longevity of their farming. I really want to pull attention to family dynamics. They're really overlooked, but they can have a big effect on how farms are managed and conservation practices are implemented. And then, of course, land ownership. Is it leased? Is it owned? How long is leased? A couple other things that were fairly important. Economic incentives were important, but not necessarily limited to just cost share. There were other economic incentives. It was great having additional partners to provide resources, either state agencies or NGOs. Conservation practices that had multiple benefits were often really liked by the farmers. Farmers need practices that are easy to manage. The second most disliked conservation practice was nutrient management because of the management time it took. And structural practices are often much easier for farmers to use than management practices. So the next lesson learned was that even after conservation practices have been adopted, you need to continue to work with the farmers on maintenance and sustained use of the practice. And I want to talk about two different watersheds. One was this Utah CEAP project, where they had implemented conservation practices a number of years before on a different project. Nutrient management was very, very important. And yet when they went back, they found that almost none of the farmers were using nutrient management. There was also a project in Pennsylvania where the primary conservation practice was to fence cows out of the creek. And this, again, this project had occurred before the NIFA-CEAP project. And when they started walking the fence lines, they found that many of them were down because farmers hadn't kept up with them, or the property had changed ownership or whatever. So you have to continue to work with farmers on many of these practices. As I already kind of mentioned, economic incentives were often required for adoption, but sometimes, especially the ones that were not profitable or fit with current systems, were problematic. You can see this is the Palouse region. This watershed project had been trying to get riparian buffers, even narrow ones, next to the streams. It was very difficult sell because as far as the farmers were concerned, they weren't particularly valuable and they caused problems with the farming. The next lessons learned was that technical assistance to farmers is most effective when delivered by a trusted local contact and is very people intensive. This particular watershed in Arkansas, they had a local person working with farmers on nutrient management, specifically nutrient management around chicken litter. And he was very effective in reducing the amount of chicken litter that was being applied. And he also helped start a program that moved chicken litter out of the watershed. But we were really concerned towards the end of the project that we were doing on synthesizing the lessons learned, because funding was eroding from NRCS, it was eroding from extension, it was eroding from soil and water. And we were really concerned about these organizations having enough people to work one-to-one with their farmers. Conservation practice adoption is a multivariate choice, and although economics are exceptionally important, there are many other factors that are part of the decision-making process. I want to talk about this particular farmer relative to this lesson learned. This was in the New York CEAP project. Cannonsville Reservoir is the drinking water resource of New York City. They were paying farmers in this reservoir to not only implement practices, but continue to implement practices. We talked to this very wise farmer who obviously upstate New York, it's a dairy farm. And we asked him, would you continue to use your conservation practices if you weren't being paid? And so he talked about how important the barns were for his calves because it kept them from getting scurvy, but it also protected bacteria from getting into the water resource from the calves that had scours. So he really liked that practice, and he definitely would have kept it up, and he might have even implemented it with his own money. On the other hand, his exclusion fencing, he didn't really like that. It was hard to farm around it. He had to keep up the fencing, and he probably wouldn't have continued with that. So he had different decision-making processes for different practices on his own farm. So then what would make conservation practice monitoring better? So again, here are some watersheds that were part of the NIFA-CEAP. And the first thing we found was that most conservation implementation projects should not conduct water quality monitoring because it's technically very challenging and it's incredibly expensive. This is from the Ohio CEAP project. It's the middle of winter. I can't imagine trying to keep my equipment going and getting reliable samples, but they did it. I mean, they're very good in this watershed. But you can just imagine how expensive this was. The next lesson learned is that if you are going to conduct water quality monitoring, that is, if you do have the technical resources and the economic resources, make sure you have a water quality monitoring design that can evaluate the response of conservation practices to water quality change. And I want to talk about the paired watershed. This was developed during the RCWP. It, in theory, is kind of simple, but I can guarantee you, because I've implemented it, can be kind of difficult. So what you do is you find two watersheds that are close to each other. They don't have to be ginormous. They can be fairly small or they can be larger. Just depends on what you want. But they have similar agriculture, similar hydrology, and you monitor them for at least 2 years. And at the end of the 2 years, you find out if they are hydrologically responsive, if they have the same hydrologic response. But monitoring them for 2 years is just a minimum. Oftentimes you have to monitor them for 4 years or more. And then after that initial monitoring program is over, to make sure they're hydrologically paired, then you put conservation practices in the study watershed. And you monitor them for another 2 to 10, 12 years. So at a minimum, a paired watershed design takes at least 4 years. Oftentimes it can take 8 years, 15 years, etc. It is really hard to find resources for these really long-term studies. But again, it's the best way to show the relationship between conservation practices and water quality. And then the next lesson learned is to make sure that you have land treatment data. And the land treatment data has to be tracked as intensively as the water quality monitoring data, and it has to be at the same temporal and spatial scales. This shows two railroads coming together. You need your water quality data and your land treatment data to come together so you can show the effects of conservation practices on water quality. Last but not least, knowledge of land use management and conservation practices is absolutely essential to understand the effectiveness of conservation programs. You can sometimes get this through aerial photos. A lot of the management data, however, is going to be in people's files at the federal level or the state level. Now, at the end of the NIFA-CEAP project, there were a lot of watersheds that had had difficulty accessing these data. I'm really pleased to say that this access is much easier for these experimental watersheds. And it's really important, especially, again, as I said, for the management data. But also keep in mind that tracking land treatment data can be really difficult, as many farmers put on conservation with their own money. And so it can be a very challenging proposition. So at this point, I want to kind of start wrapping up. So what these projects found was that erosion control has been increased substantially due to technological advances, price and labor pressures, as well as conservation programs. What this is speaking to is that a lot of watersheds moved into conservation tillage. And this was because of the technological advances around the machinery, around the herbicides. A lot of the farmers found that it was much cheaper to do conservation tillage, and they could have fewer folks working on the farms. And the conservation programs were very helpful in moving this direction. So what they were finding is that much of the sediment is coming from stream banks and stream beds, not uplands. But I just want to say there are still places in the United States where we really need to look at erosion control from the fields. There are still individual fields that have too much erosion. But all in all, this is a very positive trend. However, controlling nutrient pollution will continue to be a significant challenge. And I want to talk about why we believe this will be a significant challenge. So first of all, management practices are harder for farmers. Nutrient management is hard for farmers. It's harder for them to implement practices they can't see. As I already mentioned, they can see the sediment running off their fields. They can't see the nutrients. Farmers use nutrients to reduce risk. I actually have quite a bit of my own data here in North Carolina that shows that ease of management and risk reduction are used by farmers relative to nutrient applications. Then you have these antagonistic outcomes of conservation practices. So you might reduce sediment. So here we're talking about trade-offs. You might reduce sediment, but you might be increasing nutrients, or you might be reducing particulate P and increasing dissolved P. The year that we were putting this final report together, the farmers had just made record profits because commodity prices were extremely high. And there was so much tile drainage being added that summer in the Midwest that the tile drain companies had to put a third shift on in order to develop enough tile to meet the farmers' demands. There was also a lot of marginal land transformation, that CRP land that came out because farmers, hoped that commodity prices would stay up. The last two things are things that NIFA-CEAP didn't find, but that we thought were part of the issue relative to protecting water quality. And that is climate change is changing the timing and duration of rainfall that increases nutrient losses. And therefore, we're really going to have to think about water management practices and strategies because they're going to be critical. And also the lag times of particular pollutants are decades or more. And I want to talk specifically about these last two bullets. So this is a map from NOAA showing the frequency and intensity of rainfall from 1958 to 2021. And I don't know about the rest of you, but this is really startling. The Northeast is 60%, the North Central region is 45%, even the South is 37% increase. And what we're talking about here is changes in storm frequency, duration, and amount, which can definitely increase losses. I have some of my own data from here in North Carolina that absolutely shows that. Changes in climate causing temporal changes in pathway losses. So you may be shifting from overland flow to leaching or leaching to overland flow. And we really need to be thinking about our conservation practice designs, which may be insufficient for new conditions. And then last but not least, I want to cite this paper from Don Meals. It's really a seminal paper. Don Meals was part of the multidisciplinary, multi-institutional group that did the synthesis for NIFA-CEAP. And this is very prescient. He said the magnitude of lag time is highly site and pollutant specific, but may range from months to years for relatively short-lived contaminants, such as indicator bacteria, years to decades for excessive P levels in agricultural soils, and decades or more for sediment accumulated in river systems. I think Dr. Kleinman talked to you all last time about legacy P. So not only are we talking about decades, but maybe centuries for excess P levels in some of our agricultural soils to move into our sediments and then our river systems. And so it can take many, many years. Now, I know this is for phosphorus, but I just briefly want to talk about nitrogen. Some of the projects from the NIFA-CEAP showed that the lag time of nitrogen in shallow groundwater ranged anywhere from 10 years to 30 years. And so it can take a long time for the conservation practice effects to show up in water quality. So in the end, we concluded that taken in their aggregate and with new knowledge provided through the NIFA-CEAP projects, agencies, both public and private, industry and farmers and ranchers can increase the effectiveness of conservation practices and leverage public funds by reorienting conservation planning and implementation. Now, one of the things that I'm really happy about is many of the NIFA-CEAP lessons learned have been integrated into NRCS, and I'm going to ask Lisa Duranchek to talk about how they used NIFA-CEAP results within their agency. So take it away, Lisa.
Thanks, Deanna, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Lisa Duranchak, and I do work for NRCS in the Resource Assessment Branch on the CEAP watershed assessment studies that Deanna spoke about today. So I had the pleasure of working with her and the teams of scientists, as well as many of my colleagues throughout NRCS who work on our conservation programs, as well as our science and technology and other aspects within NRCS. And Deanna, can you go back one slide? I'm sorry, I think that got advanced.
Oh, I don't know what happened. Sorry about that.
That's okay. But I did want to share with all of you a little bit about how some of these findings and insights have been used within NRCS. So if any of you are familiar at all with NRCS's water quality conservation efforts, you would realize that we have applied a lot of these lessons to inform not only the design of our conservation programs, but also the delivery of them. And specifically, I'm talking about things that you heard Dr. Osmond speak about, for example, identifying priority watersheds, working in smaller sizes of watersheds so that we can measure and detect those effects and know that our conservation efforts are making a difference, know where to place those efforts, and implement practices to have an impact. Also, things like utilizing precision conservation approaches to identify critical source areas, for example. Approaching conservation planning on a watershed basis. And this is part of what NRCS does with area-wide conservation program delivery. It's sort of looking across a watershed to identify, areas within a watershed that can benefit from conservation treatment additionally. So that is part of it, and that helps to provide some guidance for, where conservation planning efforts working individually with landowners and agricultural producers might be able to accomplish the greatest conservation benefit for water quality and water quality outcomes, for example. Deanna talked about that avoid, control, and trap approach that we utilize very much so now in our water quality conservation initiatives, as well as programs like the Regional Conservation Partnership Program, for example. So we're looking to identify practices that can avoid losses, control losses, or trap any losses that occur incidentally because of some of this changing climate and the other factors that were discussed in the presentation. And we do have ways that we have incorporated a lot of these different aspects into screening and ranking applications for conservation. For example, some water quality initiatives for certain regional areas where they have water resource concerns have identified priority watersheds. And so implementing conservation in a priority watershed is of importance for many of our water quality conservation initiatives. We heard Deanna talk a lot about the importance of locally driven conservation. And this is very fundamental to the way that NRCS delivers its programs. And so from her lessons learned, we know that we need to continue to support that kind of one-on-one conservation technical assistance that is such an important part of NRCS's role in working with private landowners. And leveraging farmer-to-farmer networks, for example. This is something that has been discussed as being important outreach opportunity as part of some of our water quality initiatives. And then, of course, giving that consideration to preferences of agricultural producers, which practices or parts of practices might they be most interested in implementing. And incorporating that into the planning process as planners work to address conservation concerns with landowners. And lastly, we have used a lot of the data that's produced by these studies that Deanna spoke about today, but also the rest of our CEAP watershed assessment studies that are still ongoing to help us develop ways to estimate the outcomes of conservation practices. And we use this to support our annual reporting requirements that we do in NRCS, as well as to track our progress and where we need additional efforts going forward to address water resource concerns. So those are just some of the examples, but important ones that we wanted to share with you today. And Deanna, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thanks, Lisa. I really appreciate that. So in order to have done the synthesis that we did on NIFA-CEAP, we had to work with all the watershed project personnel, the key informants, NIFA-CEAP, and NRCS-CEAP. And so we were very grateful to all those folks as well as our sponsors. And then I'd like to acknowledge the synthesis team, which was, as I previously mentioned, multidisciplinary and multi-institutional. And I want to acknowledge Lisa Duranchek with USDA NRCS. She was a change agent so that we could get our lessons learned into NRCS, and Roberta Perry, who unfortunately is deceased, but she worked for EPA. And with that, I'll open the floor for questions, and I'm going to leave my slides on in case we need to go back to any questions. So any slides, excuse me. So with that, take it away, please.
Okay. Thanks very much, Deanna. That was an amazing presentation, and we do have a number of questions that are coming up in the chat. I answered a few that were pretty straightforward just for time, so that we could focus on additional ones that came in later during the presentation. So we'll go ahead and address some of those now. One thing that one viewer was wondering is, how does atrazine predominantly mobilize? Is it with sediment or in soluble forms?
Oh, that's a really good question, and it may be on my technical scope, but I think it's primarily soluble, but don't hold me to that. I don't know, probably.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that one either.
Check with your university extension. Your weed scientist will know the answer to that question.
Okay, thank you. And someone else was wondering if there were other pollutants of interest in addition to nitrogen, phosphorus, sediment, and atrazine that were evaluated in these projects. I think maybe you could reiterate that.
Yeah, so one of the projects had E. coli, and one of the projects had temperature. Temperature was the problem in Oregon, and they were trying to get riparian buffers on because the riparian buffers would lower the temperature. They had pretty good data that showed that, and it would help with the biodiversity of the stream.
Yes, thank you. And there was another question about conservation practices that were implemented in the watersheds other than conservation tillage.
Well, obviously there were a lot of terraces depending on the watershed. Ohio had a lot of terraces. Kansas had a lot of terraces, surprisingly. So yes, there were those. There were riparian buffers that were used in some of the fields. Yes, there, besides conservation tillage, I don't think at that point there was any cover crops being used because that wasn't yet a concept. There was a lot of fencing to keep cows out of the stream. Some of the projects were working with homeowners on septic tanks. Yeah, there were many different practices depending on the watershed that was being treated.
And there was another question about livestock when animals were mentioned on one of the slides. Are those confined livestock operations, and what type?
So a lot of the animals we're talking about pasture land. So I mentioned that the Pennsylvania project was primarily focused on exclusion fencing because they had a lot of pastures. I don't know if you all noticed the, the riparian buffer in the Utah-CEAP project, which was a fencing in some older vehicles, but there was even some pasture situations in Utah that were being fenced, and Kansas had some fencing. A number of the projects that were mixed, what I would call more mixed land use, definitely had cows. Now, as far as confined animal operations, the only one that I believe we had was New York, and they had dairy cows. So we weren't looking anywhere at poultry or pigs.
Yep, and those are addressed in some other CEAP watershed studies that were not part of this particular synthesis project. So if you're interested in that, you can look on the CEAP website. There was also a question about the sizes of the watersheds, where the water quality results were evaluated, and if water quality was evaluated at the outlet of the watershed. And I did take a stab at that in the chat, Deanna, but if you'd like to talk a little bit more about how the water quality results were evaluated and at what scale, that would be great.
Okay, so you probably noticed the Cheney Reservoir watershed in Kansas. It went over almost 4 counties, and I'm actually from Wichita, and those are large counties. And so some of these watersheds were very large, and the water quality was monitored at the outlet. But some of the other watersheds were much smaller. It depended. And some of the watersheds had different kinds of monitoring. They would have paired watersheds, but in the paired watersheds, they would have portions of the paired watersheds being monitored more separately so that it was a smaller area. Lake Erie, that particular watershed in Ohio, is amazing because they've been monitoring there probably for, I don't know, 50 years maybe. It's just an amazing record, and they have different scales of monitoring there too. And so it really depended on the project as to the size of the watershed.
Yeah, thank you, Deanna. Different scales of monitoring are definitely helpful for understanding the effects of conservation practices. One last question, where do you see the dissolved phosphorus problem going with all the focus on less tillage in pursuit of soil health and carbon sequestration?
So one of the things that I mentioned in the presentation is that conservation practices that fill multiple roles can be very useful. And so sometimes you have these trade-offs, but you have to consider what the trade-off is. But here's what I think about dissolved phosphorus. I just gave a presentation on phosphorus, and there was a quote by a scientist who had done a meta-analysis on conservation practices and phosphorus losses. And there was a quote from that paper that I used that said, the best way to handle dissolved phosphorus is to make sure you're using nutrient management. And so that means that we need to get, in some areas, not all areas, but some areas, we need to start drawing down the phosphorus we have in the soil to reduce the dissolved phosphorus. We need to start drawing down the phosphorus in the soils, because if you're not putting on phosphorus, that's a source of dissolved phosphorus that you're not losing. So nutrient management is really going to be the key to dissolved phosphorus. And we need to start using those savings accounts of phosphorus that we've built up in the soil in some places. Again, not all places, but some places.
Thanks very much, Deanna. We're going to turn it back over to Creech to wrap us up today. Thanks everyone for attending.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all. So I know we might have some people that need to hop right now at the top of the hour. You've seen the most important thing. I'll give 2 quick plugs for those that can hang in for 60 more seconds. The first is just a huge thank you. Thank you to our Deputy Chief for joining. Thank you to our presenter. Thank you to Lisa Duranchek. This is very important work and it's exciting to see it presented. Thank you to you all for attending. You know, I know that it's a busy time of year for many people, so thanks for the hour today. If you're curious to see resources from this webinar, including this presentation recording, including Dr. Osmond's slides, those will be available on our Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage by early November. And I'll try to say it correctly one more time. That's nrcs.usda.gov/conservation-outcomes-webinar. And it just popped up in the chat as well, so you can snag the link there. Lisa mentioned that there are many other resources under CEAP watersheds. So if you're curious to learn more about that portfolio, visit nrcs.usda.gov/CEAP/watersheds, and that's also available in the chat. And then if you have other questions that you weren't able to get to, we added some contact information. So please reach out to us. We'll get questions over to Dr. Osmond as needed. And then the last thing, it is the end of the calendar year. We have another good year of webinars coming up. So we are very soon going to share our tentative 2025 webinar calendar. That will be available on our Conservation Outcomes Webinar Series webpage. Keep an eye on that page. Early November, by mid-November, that will be live. So we hope to see you in the coming year. This is our last webinar for 2024. Thank you for everyone who's joined and hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye, everyone.